Hey Claire, how you doing today?
Hey, good. How's it going?
It's going good. So I wanted to ask you to get us started because it's the week of Halloween. What is or was your most memorable Halloween costume as a child? Or I guess even not as a child. Just what was your favorite over the years?
Okay. I'm like going through the file cabinet in my brain and all the pictures.
No, everyone's
Most,
picturing SpongeBob and,
yes.
his filing room.
I feel like I quote that scene too much, but
I know, right?
anyway, I guess most memorable costume was my brother is 3 years older than I am, and I think when I was like 7 or 8, we had recently gotten a dog
Uh-huh.
like the year before. And so this Halloween, we decided to do a collab costume as a theme.
Yeah.
And we always kind of grew up watching Star Wars and the movies. And I think from what I can remember, Brian dressed up as Darth Vader, my brother, and then I dressed up as Padme from like the prequels.
Mm-hmm.
And then we dressed our dog up as Yoda. And I
Oh
vividly,
my
we still have
gosh.
pictures of this to this day, and I
That
will
is
share them with
hysterical.
you
You
guys
need
because
to.
there is one picture where I promise you, we do look like we could conquer the entire galaxy. Like
Oh my gosh.
our posing, the dog, the fact that we dressed the dog up, and the fact that the dog actually let the costume stay
Like
on
participated?
longer
Yes.
than for like more than 5 seconds was
Oh,
pretty amazing. But the reason it's also very like memorable is because my mom dyed my hair brown for
okay.
it. And I
Yeah,
was in
like
like,
committed.
yeah, I think I was like 7 or 8.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, she had dyed it brown, and it wasn't like a super in-depth dye, but I think my hair was brown for maybe 2 weeks or something. So
Yeah.
that also was like really funny because that was the first time I had ever had my hair dyed, and we dyed it in the bathroom.
That is so
So
much
yeah,
fun.
that's probably the most memorable one. But I mean, we also too, like when you're a kid, at least for me, pretty much most Halloweens, it was like find the Disney princess who has the same
Oh,
hair as
sure.
you.
I know, right?
So I was Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, different things like that.
Oh,
So
yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah.
I relate. I feel like mine were very similar to that. Or like, I really wanted to be a gymnast there for a little bit. So I would like, yeah, I know. Hilarious now. Um, so I would like wear my little like leotards and stuff and my little medals for my little meets that I would go to that were like so tiny and so beyond. So you'd be like everyone got one, like one of those.
Uh huh.
But I think my most memorable is one of those situations where I don't actually know if it's my memory, and I'm wondering if anyone else like has this happen in their childhood. So it's like something happens, and it obviously happened to you, like you were there, but then you see pictures of it, and then you also hear your parents tell the story, and so then you're like, I don't know if I remember this for myself because like I have this memory and I experienced it,
Uh huh.
or if I remember my parents telling me that this happened, and then I remember the pictures, and so then my brain kind of like makes a memory. It's like, does that make
Like
sense?
a
Does anyone
second
else have that?
party
Yeah,
intel.
like
Yeah.
I don't know if this is actually my memory or not, but a Halloween costume that comes up every single year for me and my mom is one year she dressed me up as a pumpkin, which I think is so funny. Like every kid has to be a pumpkin at least
Oh yeah.
once. I think it's just like a right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so she dressed me up. I had this cute little pumpkin costume. I mean, I was like definitely old enough to walk. So like, and like walk enough to like go trick-or-treating. And Graham just turned 2 and he's like not quite there. Like we're gonna have to like pull him around in a wagon, like so old enough to where like I was going to do this, and I like understood, like I remember understanding what I was doing and that I was going to get candy, like I had the important things in mind. And so mom was like, I'm gonna paint your face orange. So she painted my face orange, and I'm like all excited. I have the little stem hat situation. And she's like, okay, your face is all done. And she like points me towards the mirror. And this is where I don't know if it's my memory or hers, but she said that as soon as I saw myself and that I saw that I was like completely orange, that I just like screamed crying and was like scared of my reflection because I didn't realize that I was going to be orange. So like young enough to where that concept just did not register.
Aww.
And I just think it's hilarious. Like to this day, we laugh about that and talk about like, when is it going to be Graham's year to be a pumpkin? Like, am I gonna try? Yeah, what's his reaction gonna be? Like, am I gonna commit to like painting his face orange, or are we gonna skip that? Like, what are we? Anyway, so we literally talk about that every year, even like before Graham. We would just kind of be like, you remember when I thought it was gonna be a great idea to paint your face orange as a pumpkin? Like, we laugh at it all the time. So again, it's definitely the most memorable costume in terms of like looking back, and I just so much comes back to me, even though I genuinely don't know if they're my memories or not. But I think that that's just so funny how those things can like stick with us, you know? Okay, fam, so we're so excited because this week we have a new series, and I'm really excited about it, as we always are, but I think it's going to be a really good one. But even more than that, I think it's going to be really challenging to hopefully you as a listener, but us too, like, because the topic we're talking about, we're going to do a series on idolatry, and we're calling it Worthless Pursuit. And we just wanted to walk you through why that's what we're calling it. I think it'll make sense, truthfully, like as we go through our series, but we're going with Worthless Pursuit, our series on idolatry, because ultimately idols are a worthless pursuit in our lives. And we're going to talk later, like, even if they're good things, when you misplace that worship and put it above the Lord, the pursuit of that is going to get you absolutely nowhere.
Yes, because with idolatry, we're really having to pause and ask ourselves a question of, do I place the value of blank over the value of God in my life? Or am I spending more time worshiping this one thing or this person more than I'm worshiping God? And so it's really just this question of asking ourselves that heart issue, but also where our time and our value is placed on what. And to just start us off, just talking about what an idol actually is. So there's this book called Gospel Treason that I read about 2 years ago. A really good friend of mine recommended it. It's on idolatry. It is by Brad Bigney, and it speaks so heavily on the topic of idolatry, understanding what idolatry is, and also being to assess certain idols in your lives during certain seasons. But in his book, he defines an idol as anything or anyone that captures our hearts, our minds, and our affections more than God. And I actually also looked up on our Google machine what the top 4 synonyms of the word idolatry is. And it's worship, adoration, reverence, and devotion, which I think is really interesting because those are all, things that we would use in topic in relation to God. Like, we worship God, we adore God, we devote our time to God. And so it's also just really, really interesting to see how idolatry is going to be this thing where we're placing something over God in worship and devotion and what that looks like.
Yeah, because those words are very positive. Like they have a very positive connotation. But then I think when we look at idolatry, I feel confident that just about everyone agrees that there's a negative connotation to that. So I just think that is really interesting that the synonyms are positive words, like you said, that point us to Christ, or for us as Christians, make us think of our relationship with Christ. That really shows or drives home a lot of what there is to discover and talk about here when looking at idols and modern day idols, especially in our lives today. And I think another way for us to define idolatry or look at it is pulling off of what you're saying earlier, but like misplaced worship. And I know that, when we're looking at worship, adoration, reverence, devotion, those synonyms you talked about, the opposite of that is really what the heart of idolatry is misplacing it and giving what you should be giving to God. You're giving it to something else. You're letting something else take your attention and your energy, hence the worthless pursuit component that we're talking about. But I think a picture for us, and we're going to look at many examples in the next few minutes, but if we consider like Adam and Eve in Genesis, they had everything was right, everything was perfect. But then they took this worship and misplaced it and chose to believe that they could create this better God for themselves when they decided to trust the enemy, when they decided to do what the Lord commanded them not to do. That was idolatry in motion, because they took their worship towards the Lord and misplaced it towards something else, and then sin entered the world, and then we have that spiral from there on out. So I think if we simplify idolatry to that, it makes it easier for us to understand, you know?
When humans were created, we were created to worship God. And we've always had this natural tendency to want to worship something. And then so when sin entered, it was like, well, instead of worshiping God, now we have found hundreds of other things that we can cling to as idols in replace of that worship to God. And so it's just interesting to see how like our nature of being human, but also made in God's image, that we're created to want to worship something. And now it's like, but now we can be worshiping the wrong things for the wrong reasons, or even worshiping good things, but worshiping them out of a incorrect heart posture.
We see this theme of us being created to worship all throughout Scripture. I mean, because that's kind of the point, right? That we were created to worship the Lord. But here are just a few references that I think will be helpful. The first one is 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. It doesn't inherently say worship, but if every single thing that we're doing is honoring the Lord and giving him glory, then hello, that equals worship. And that's one of our favorite verses here at On Purpose and For a Purpose. So I obviously had to throw it in today. The next is Isaiah 43:7. And then also Isaiah 43:21. So I'm going to just read both back to back. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. So God saying, I made you and I created you for my glory. And then verse 21, the people I formed for myself, that they may proclaim my praise. Again, you were created so that he has worship and praise. And then lastly, Revelation 4:11, you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being.
I love all of those verses and how they all have something just connected to them. And kind of when you were reading them, I just noticed. So each one of them talks about for the glory of God. They all pinpoint to that. And I think that's amazing because, you know, it is like you were saying, we were created to worship. And then on top of that, we were created worship for the glory of God. It's like for our good, but it's also for him as well. And I think sometimes with idolatry, just what I've recognized in my own life is that we can have idols be these physical objects or physical people, but the sin of idolatry is actually a heart issue within us. It's not always going to be a physical act. It's going to be more of we got to look at the root of our hearts and understand, you know, how or why we're misplacing worship on something over the worship of God in our lives. So it's kind of, we have to look at the why and the how, and then we also have to look at the when, and seeing in certain environments or certain amounts of times that we're spending on something, if those idols are popping up more for us, and maybe we're feeling, you know, like we're investing too much of our time into one thing instead of trying to come back to God and seeking him first.
Yeah, I really think it's crucial what you were saying about it being a heart issue. We've already kind of been saying that, this saying it without saying it, I guess, this whole episode so far. But I want us to look at Ezekiel 14. There's just a handful of verses there that will really drive home this imagery of it being a heart issue before anything else happens. Because, you know, before we fall victim to the idol physically or by putting something, you know, an action, it's going to first start in our hearts, right? And that's why Claire's saying we got to look at the why and the how and the when. That's going to help us discover that root issue that's in our hearts. But if we look in Ezekiel 14, we're going to read verses 3-5. This is God talking to Ezekiel. Ezekiel's a prophet. So God's saying, Son of man, these men have set up idols in their hearts and put wicked stumbling blocks before their faces. Should I let them inquire of me at all? Therefore, speak to them and tell them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. When any of the Israelites set up idols in their hearts and put a wicked stumbling block before their faces and then go to a prophet, I, the Lord, will answer them myself in keeping with their great idolatry. I will do this to recapture the hearts of the people of Israel who have all deserted me for their idols. First of all, that is such a strong thing to read. It is such a oh my goodness type of verses to read. I think it's very easy for us to be like, no one knows that I'm doing this. Sometimes we don't even know that we're doing it, but I think it's really easy to be like, oh, I'm just going to bump this up a peg in my order of priorities, and here's God, but I'm just going to scoot this here, I'm going to scoot this here, I'm going to kind of ease it up. And we feel like we're being really sly. We feel like we're doing that really, under the radar. And again, because we might not even realize that that's what we're doing. But Ezekiel, these verses make us confront and realize that the Lord knows. He knows the moment that he is not on the throne of our hearts and we put something else there. He is aware. He knows. And he calls it a wicked stumbling block that's right in front of their face that they either are aware of or not aware of. He sees it, and it's not a secret to him. He is completely aware of it. And he says there's an accountability to it as well, because he says, I will make them answer in accordance to their idolatry. Whatever they put before me, I will make them answer to that. And I also think that the way verse 5 is worded is really beautiful too, because even with that, that's outrageous and horrible for us to do. In verse 5, the Lord says, but I will recapture the hearts of the people of Israel who have deserted me for their idols. He's saying, you have left me. You have deserted me. That is a strong word. But I am going to work to recapture your heart because it's a heart issue. Those verses are really powerful. I am really happy that we were able to study those for this series.
Yeah, I love the recapture their hearts. That's beautiful, that imagery. And it's so interesting to see too, because I've been doing a chronological study of the Bible, and recently, within the past couple of months, I've been kind of in Isaiah and Jeremiah, and just so much there's an issue of idolatry in those chapters of the people. And again and again and again, God is like, turn back to me, turn away from these worthless idols. Yeah. And again, the people, they don't. And it's interesting to see how throughout all of the Bible, even when Jesus is in his ministry, even after Jesus leaves and Paul is there, Peter's there, and James, so many of the apostles are speaking on the topic of idolatry and how it is such an issue, and really is something that stops us in our tracks and almost doesn't allow us to move closer to God because it is sin. And I think sometimes we don't really recognize that either. We don't really recognize the severity of our idols and the most value that we're placing on things over God and what that's really doing to our relationship with the Lord. Something else too I wanted us to look back on was, me, I'm always bringing up Exodus. I feel like in the past couple episodes, in Ruth, it was like Exodus, and still we're going to go to Exodus.
We're still there.
Yeah.
We're still there.
There's a lot that happens in Exodus.
There is.
But we first see God's warning about idolatry to the people in Exodus 20 when he's speaking about the 10 commandments. So I'm going to read this. It's Exodus 20 verses 1 through 6. So it says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. That is so just a lot, and there's more to the 10 commandments after that, but I think that stands out so much just because he's telling you, A, he is the Lord first, B, he acknowledges where he's brought them out of, and then he goes into telling them that you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make yourself an image or anything to try to capture the likeness of me, and try to misplace that worship on that. Like, he is the one that deserves the worship, and he's also a jealous God. I think that's also really interesting too, of just understanding this aspect of what does jealousy mean when it's speaking about like a jealous God. It means that he wants your heart. He doesn't want you to misplace anything over him in your life. Like, he wants you to come to him.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful too. Because it's hard for us to see the word jealousy in a way that is pure and perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we're jealous, it's sin more often that is causing that to happen. But when God's jealous, he wants all of us. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
just makes his character even more, because the magnitude of who he is wants all of us, every
Mm-hmm.
ounce of our worship and our adoration. It's just really beautiful, and it's very humbling to consider that he loves us that much, that he wants all of us. Like, he doesn't want a single ounce to going anywhere else. But then also with these verses, I need to know if I'm alone, or that most everyone can kind of diminish this or like minimize it in your life, because you're like, oh, well, I don't worship any other gods. I'm not making any carved images for myself. I don't have any gold calves hanging out in my living room. Like, this isn't an issue for me. We're all good. And we can kind of shove this topic away and be like, oh, that applied to them in the Old Testament. That applied
Mm-hmm.
to other people. That applies to other religions, and excuse ourselves from this conversation. But what we've already said, so if this is probably a broken record to you, but we can't read those verses and not acknowledge that, yes, those are obvious forms of idolatry. And there are some that are more obvious than others. But as soon, like we were saying earlier, as soon as God no longer has that throne of your heart position in your life, as soon as something else becomes more important, you have an idolatry issue. And I think a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, realize that that is an everyday, every hour thing that we have to face and allow God to recapture our heart over and over again throughout the day to get ourselves back in alignment. That is what being sanctified is as a Christian, that process of becoming more and more like Christ. So I think it's really important for us to look at that and allow ourselves to consider, where in our hearts is that happening? What causes that to rile up in us, so that we can put a name to it, and so that we can then move forward with allowing God to recapture.
Yeah, and I think too, another good point is trying to also assess, okay, what could be an idol in our life? You know, like, what actually could be an idol? In Psalms 135, verses 15 through 18, it says, "The idols of the nations are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, nor is there breath in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all those who trust in them." And so, again, going back to that, idols can be something that are a good thing in our lives. It could be a marriage, it could be your kids, it could be a job, it could be good things that you desire for and you want to achieve. But then it's like when we're misplacing that value or that worship onto those things, and that's what we're spending like all of our time devoting ourselves to, of like, oh, I'm just trying to get up the ladder in my job and I'm just spending all of my time devoted into that. Or that's the thing where I have my identity or worth in truly more than God. Then it's like those things can start to be, again, that heart issue of like, these could be really good things in our lives that we should pursue. But when we start to pursue them over God, then that's when it becomes that worthless pursuit.
Yeah. Well Watered Woman has a blog on this topic that I found, and there's so much good in there. We're going to put it in the show notes for y'all. But there was they like simplified idolatry to three things that it does. So this, like, when we're, what Claire just said, like, how, okay, so now you're telling me that good things can even be an idol. Like, how am I supposed to know? Is everything an idol? Like, how do I know that I have anything in line? Okay, this is kind of a place you can start where you can say, okay, if it does this, this, or this, I need to look at this closer and evaluate in my own life. And the 3 things that they pointed out was if it devalues your relationship with God, meaning if you feel like you're putting way more credibility in something else, like I will have success, I will have fulfillment, I will be satisfied if I do this, or if you're putting your trust into something else, whatever it may be, then you're devaluing your relationship with the Lord because you're saying, oop, I don't need God to get me through this. I have my spouse. I trust them to get me through this. Or I have my job. I will be successful and satisfied because of my job. And you're devaluing your relationship with the Lord. Okay, that's one. The second, if it causes you to neglect your relationship with the Lord, if you're putting all of your time into this other thing and you're not giving yourself space to spend time with the Lord because you think this other thing is more important, maybe it's your health. You know what? In the morning, I'm going to make sure that I can get in the best, longest workout possible. I'll read my Bible later. And then you never do, or you never think to pray because you're always doing something else, putting something else before, you're neglecting that relationship with the Lord. That could be a red flag for us that maybe I'm letting something else have a seat on the throne of my heart. And then the third, if it's something that causes bitterness towards the Lord. So if you are really hoping for something, if you're single and you're hoping so badly for a spouse that when the Lord doesn't give it to you yet, you feel bitter towards him, it's his fault you don't have it yet, you're probably allowing it to have more ownership of your heart than you should. Or if you're someone desiring a child, desiring a family, desiring a promotion at work, and when it's not given to you, you feel bitterness and you place blame on the Lord for that, it's probably in a position of power in your heart that it shouldn't have. And saying all of that and acknowledging all of that is easier than actually asking yourself those questions and being honest with, where do I see those things happening across the board of my heart? Where do I actually see myself allowing these other things in my life to become priority over God? Because I think when we explain it like this, that's why I loved this article from them. When you break it down like that, devaluing, neglecting, causing bitterness, that actually makes it make more sense. It makes it easier for us to call out, oh, maybe that is an idol in my life if it's doing those 3 things.
Again, going back to that misplaced worship, but then also, well, then how is it affecting my relationship with the Lord and my walk with him?
Right. Yeah. When you're able to actually see that cause and effect, that is really, that can be, now, sure, I would love for us to be able to notice as soon, at the very beginning, as soon as we let that worship get misplaced, but more times than not, we're not going to actually be aware that the idol is there until we get to the effect. This is what our actions caused. And then we'll be able to see, ooh, that doesn't feel right. I think that could operate better. Then you'll kind of be able to see, yeah, there might be something going on there. There's another quote from that blog that I love too that I'm going to read for y'all. And if hopefully you read the blog for yourself and you can see there's so much more. I feel like I could have quoted the whole blog, but this one in particular, I think really drives this home. So it says, with the idolatry of good things, because remember, in this conversation, we're talking about not necessarily things that are obviously bad, taking good things and just letting them be moved up a notch ahead of God on that, like, totem pole, I guess, of our hearts. So with the idolatry of good things, the Lord becomes lesser and your future and what you want for yourself becomes greater. And I think that really helps us kind of put this in focus too. And it also stings real bad to define it that way when you're like, ooh, I really am putting myself and what I think's best for me above the Lord, making him lesser. That doesn't feel good at all to admit to ourselves, but we have to. We have to. It's vital that we acknowledge what we're doing so that we can get on track.
It also calls out Jonah 2:8, where it says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. Like imagery, it literally shows you those who are clinging on to an idol, you are turning yourself away from God's love towards you. So it's like, it's almost like you're shutting a door, like you're trying to grab onto something else to where you're closing off his love for you. And that's really just a great explanation of what an idol really kind of looks like in that heart issue in our lives over time, in that process of the longer that I hold on to something, the longer that I'm clinging on to it, I'm actually lessening God's love to enter to my life and to enter towards me and to feel that presence of the Holy Spirit within me, because you're turning it off and you're shutting it off the longer you hold on to it.
Right. And you're denying yourself that opportunity to be loved, which is huge too. And it is similar concept in Romans 1:25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the creator, who is forever praised. Amen. And so that is obviously talking about, like, if we're taking this verse and we're looping it back to Exodus, they literally created a physical thing. But also, if we're looking at things, that's not our problem area. If it's our marriage, our children, our jobs, money, success, popularity, people liking us, I mean, we could just keep going on. Our comfort, there's so many things, our control over the things of our lives. If we keep snowballing with that, all of that was created as well by our creator. It's not, it doesn't feel as obvious, but like, we are all created beings. We are. So even if we are, if we're worshiping ourselves and we make our success, our well-likeness, our us, all about us all the time, then that's the same thing as it being worshiping the created thing over the creator. But what I love about this verse is that very first line. They exchange the truth about God for a lie. That's as simple as it is. That is what idolatry is. It's a lie that pursuing this worthless pursuit of this will give you the same thing and more than pursuing the Lord. All the way back to Genesis and the Garden of Eden, it boils all the way down to that. If you choose this, you will get more because God is withholding from you. That is like the bottom line of idolatry, and why we choose to take that into our own hands, because we think that there is more for us, that the Lord is just withholding, but we know that that's a lie.
And I think for both of us, the reason that we wanted to talk about the topic of idolatry is because it's not talked about enough. And it's something that we need to be able to assess in our own lives, but also being able to, have someone hold us accountable to noticing these things too in our lives. Like, if I notice in a season of my life where I'm idolizing just my job or anything over God, I need to be able to acknowledge it, but then I also need to let somebody else know about it and kind of have that conversation of, hey, I'm kind of noticing right now, like, I'm really idolizing my career or my job or something over God. Can you please just kind of be praying for me on it? But then also, can I talk to you about this furthermore as I'm like processing and going through this? Because I think when we let people in and don't hide it underneath the covers and underneath the wall, like, when we let people in and start to have those conversations about it, it almost lets that light come into that conversation. But then it feels like the chains aren't holding you as tight, and it feels like you're not clinging to it as much when you start to acknowledge it and speak it into the existence that it is. So I feel like for this episode right here is we really just want you guys to be able to start to assess and process and think about different things that we've talked about, reflecting on them, asking yourself those questions through what Savannah talked about. I also wanted to mention some questions through this book, Gospel Treason, that was brought up, and just some ways that might be helpful to assess idols in your life. Some of the ones that he had mentioned were, are you willing to sin to get this? So that blank, whatever that idol is, are you willing to sin to get it? But are you also willing to sin if you were to lose it? And then, do you turn to this as a refuge and comfort instead of going to God? So just being able to use those questions and use this episode as reflection to assess idolatry in your life. And then for the next coming episodes, we specifically want to talk about some different idols that we could have in our lives. Kind of what Savannah was saying over, idolizing comfort, idolizing control, idolizing success or ourselves or other people. What does that look like? Because it is something that is a practical aspect of our lifestyle and something that we need to be able to notice and acknowledge. And then what do we need to do about it? So we just really hope that this encourages you guys. And I know it is a challenging and convicting topic, but it's not something that you have to do alone. And it's so much better when you let other people in and you have other people to talk about it with. Hey, podcast fam. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode today. I hope that it was encouraging and uplifting to your week. We just love to connect with you guys, so if you haven't already, give us a follow on Instagram at On Purpose Podcast. It is a great way for us to hear from you and for us to just share a little bit of different things around these topics and discussions to continue those conversations online. We also would love for you to leave us a review sometime if you have a chance. This is a great way for us to hear a little bit about what you think of the podcast and also any sort of topics you want us to discuss in the future. We just love being able to connect with you guys on many different platforms. So with that being said, I hope that y'all have a great rest of your week and that you'll tune in with us next Monday to learn more about how to live on purpose and for a purpose.